Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I grew up thinking of it as, again, this beautiful, joyful, natural thing that happens. I had no idea that there was issues with latching, there were issues with flow, there was issues with, a dozen things that happen. It's almost like the secret
overproduction,
right.
underproduction,
leaking through shirts, and it's like this whole underground, subculture that no one tells you about. I remember sort of having a conversation with my friends who were already moms, saying, "How come none of you at any point said this?" That would have been useful to know.
In the second episode of Being a Present Parent, Tena and Gauri reflect on the trends, surprises, and lessons learned from a year of circles and workshops on topics such as sex and postpartum, trauma and vocabulary, birth and autonomy, and medical science's approach to obstetrics and gynaecology, while they share personal stories and insights. And now, over to Gauri and Tena.
Hi, my name is Tena, and welcome back to the second episode of our three-part podcast series on feminist parenting. Last time we spoke about what is feminism, what is feminist parenting, and why it matters. In this episode, we're going to look at some lessons and learnings that we've gathered over the past 1 year of working in this space, some things that keep popping up that we can say are almost universal, and some things that we found surprising. Gauri, would you kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. The first thing that deserves mention, of course, is the ubiquitousness of trauma. And not to say that it was surprising to us, just given our own experiences as new moms, but the universality of not just the fact that it was a difficult transition for women, and we perhaps lacked all the infrastructural support that was necessary, but just the silence around it. That, it took women attending circles to be able to say, "I've never spoken about this," or "I've never been able to call it that," was surprising to us because, like we mentioned yesterday, it is this grand, ultimate experience in people's lives, right? And we live in a country that truly celebrates a woman having a child as our ultimate in reaching the next stage of our evolution and our family destinies. So the fact that there wasn't perhaps the necessary care given to women to prepare them for the process of birth, to then support them in the process of postpartum and transition from becoming women to mothers, and then the whole longevity of it, because it isn't, you can't be like, okay, now the 40 days are done, let's move on to the next stage. It's still an ongoing long-term support and care that is required.
Yeah, I think that when we speak about trauma, for a lot of us, that is such a big, loaded word, and a lot of us are almost reluctant to use it to describe our own lived experiences, right? So when you think about trauma, you think about war, homelessness, illness, death in family, sexual assault, and things like that. But one thing that we have discovered is that trauma can also really be a result of prolonged living under adverse circumstances, right? So it can be the trauma of being lower caste, it can be the trauma of racism, it can be the trauma of patriarchy, it can be the trauma of sexism. There are a lot of different ways that we experience trauma, that we store trauma in our bodies, and that it then manifests itself through the parenting. And I think that looking at trauma from this intersectional perspective really then grounds it as a feminist issue, because it ties in with so many other parts of our lives, and then it kind of spills over into our parenting practices in ways that none of us want, right? None of us want to be bringing that trauma into our parenting practices, but it's almost unavoidable if we are not dealing with it or acknowledging it or even having the vocabulary to name it.
And I think for me, what was most surprising also was it isn't just about, and again, we often associate trauma with adverse reactions to things. Sometimes it's, perfectionism. Sometimes it's really kind of over-parenting or going above and beyond what's required. And I think for me, that was one of the most surprising things about thinking of parenting through trauma, because it also meant people not giving them permission to exhibit a degree of benign neglect, for example. Your child will be okay, they're playing by themselves for a couple of hours in the day. You don't have to overschedule them, for example. Or it's okay for you to take breaks or not always have appropriate, measured, calm reactions, tantrums, that you needed to allow yourself the grace to be human. Somehow we think of sort of parents as, now you were done with the human experience and you're descended to, to the gods, and you had to always at any given time be your best self.
Yeah, I think very often we do think about, well, if you are parenting as a parent who has experienced trauma, it means neglect, it means coldness and all of these things. But you're so right, because what we have seen has been really the opposite of that. It has been this like continuous, I have to keep on doing rather than just being, right? I have to keep on doing stuff to make sure that my child does not feel the effects of my trauma and that it doesn't spill over into my parenting. However, I do think that there are spaces for mothers. We are creating spaces for ourselves. We are giving each other the permission to be vulnerable, to speak about these things, to have the vocabulary. I do not see the same thing happening in fatherhood spaces or in masculinity spaces.
Very true. And I think also some of this is, and perhaps part of it is good. We are all aware that a lot of the damage that adults carry is because of perhaps how they were raised, or the lack of attention a generation ago to the potential sort of harm you can do to a child through certain behaviors and practices. I think perhaps it's made us overcautious. I think as urban, educated, middle class parents, I think there is this huge onus on us to say, I could damage my child, or, my child might end up in therapy in XYZ years. And I think that what happens is perhaps an unequal amount of pressure on women to also carry that load of ensuring that there's care XX or care plus.
I do think, by the way, that your child ending up in therapy is a good thing. I think that everybody should be in therapy. So this raising of mental health awareness to a level where it really becomes like going to a dentist once a year, it's also not something to be afraid of necessarily. But I do think that you rightly put, there is an onus on, it brings us back to the topic of mothering versus motherhood, right? And there is an onus of perfection that's associated with motherhood, but it also creates an uneven dynamic within couples themselves when you have one partner that is doing this extremely deep kind of transformational self-work and the other partner that's almost not even aware that that is an option, right? Because it is still seen as the traditionally feminine work of this transformative change.
Anecdotally, we see this a lot. I don't know what the statistics are for this, but the good enough parenting as happily embraced by fathers. And anytime they are doing even a little bit more than that, they're amazing. And everybody feels the need to celebrate that. While with women, we only notice if we think they're not being good enough mothers. There isn't really the permissions are very different to men and women.
But who gives those permissions? And who abides by those permissions? Because we are also upholding that in our everyday life, right? If we abide by that and take this into account and allow this, and this is obviously easier said than done, but allow this to actually influence our parenting and our view of ourselves, the only thing we're actually doing is perpetuating the entire status quo, right? So a lot of this transformational, deeply feminist work also comes from saying screw it to things that don't serve us, right? And what you're saying is very true, and I've seen this in my own life as well. The bar to be a good mother is extremely high. The bar to be a good father is very low, right? The first time we ever took Leo out for a barbecue, my husband went to change his diaper, and all of our friends were like, oh my God, he's such an involved father.
Right. Standing ovation.
Which he is, but not because he changed the diaper. He's an involved father because he's in therapy with me, right?
Right. And, the number of times I've heard Rahul referred to as a hands-on father. And I think there is no word for a mother like that. There is no equivalent hands-on mother. What is that? That's just a mom.
That's just a mom. You're either a hands-on mom or you're a negligent mom. But no one is ever going to congratulate you being a hands-on mom. Do you think that in itself, this double standards that are implicit, explicit, and deeply internalized, is a form of trauma itself.
In fact, I actually think that might be why women are maybe doing more of the work, because the shoe's pinching much more, right? There is more reason we end up in therapy because there is death by 1,000 cuts. And I think it's that if you're getting by or gliding by or cruising along, often what you discover in therapy just, it opens a whole sort of box to things that you hadn't discovered before. So yes, you're right. I think it is that. I also think it's this enduring ideal of what's biological, what is innate, what just comes naturally to us. And I think I don't know how many generations away from being able to really undo that thought process, that we'll just be able to do, because it's biological, hence it's easy.
And when you actually break it down and you look at it, you realize that nothing of this is biological actually in its essence, right? Why am I better at soothing my newborn? Because every time a newborn cries, people are passing the newborn to me. They're not passing it to my husband, right? Which means I just get X amount of more chances to learn the soothing mechanisms. But when you start internalizing as this means that I am the expert, which means that I have to take on this appropriate amount of load, this is where also a lot of issues arise from.
The surprise of even what is biological can be difficult or challenging. I had no idea that there was such a thing as lactation consultants. And, people made good money from training women and supporting women through breastfeeding, because I grew up thinking of it as, again, this beautiful, joyful, natural thing that happens. I had no idea that there was issues with latching, there were issues with flow, there was issues with, a dozen things that happen. It's almost like the secret
overproduction,
right.
underproduction,
leaking through shirts, and it's like this whole underground, subculture that no one tells you about. I remember sort of having a conversation with my friends who were already moms, saying, "How come none of you at any point said this?" That would have been useful to know.
My favorite thing is that until you have children, all of your friends are like, "You have to have a baby. It's going to be the most amazing thing." And then when you have a baby, they'll look at you like, yeah, this is the worst thing. It's so hard. So why were you telling me to have one in the first place? There's a lot of come join the misery, but we're not going to tell you all the ugly stuff that happens behind closed doors.
And I think it's also just giving ourselves permission to hold opposing thoughts, right? Because it is amazing and wonderful and joyful, and it is incredibly hard. And I think somehow we seem to just want to keep it simple and feel that if you feel A, then you cannot feel the opposite of it, which often we do.
There's a lot of, I think, guilt that gets passed on around it as well, as with so many things around parenthood. And this kind of, I think, brings us back to the second topic as well, which is the whole body autonomy and birth, because even if you struggle with these things that are supposed to be natural, you will be put under a tremendous amount of guilt, because what are you complaining about, right? You were capable of carrying a pregnancy at the end. You have a healthy child. None of you died, right? What is there to complain about? Most of you didn't die. What are you actually complaining about? And when it comes to the natural part of even the breastfeeding, one of my pet peeves is when people ask me if I had a natural delivery. Yes, he came from my uterus. He didn't come from my nose, right? So this idea of putting these life-saving interventions as less than, because it's not absolutely as it happens in nature, is just another way of adding a layer of trauma and guilt to an event that in itself is physically extremely traumatic.
I remember my gynaec saying, "Then stop taking elevators." He was like, "You want to keep everything natural," and I did the whole I want to do it without the epidural, and I want to be meditating or whatever, seeing white lights and unicorns as I give birth. But the fact is, so many other aspects of our life, there are interventions that we give ourselves full permission to without feeling like they've been sullied in any way. But somehow, there is that knife the surgeon has in his hand, and then something's changed. And, it's a whole different kind of birth. And why are we even talking about this as a dichotomy, right? Why do people who are perfect strangers feel like they have the permission to come up to you and say, "Did you have a C-section or a natural birth?"
And this brings us back to what we spoke about in the last episode, which is this spectrum of lived and feminist experience. And again, you and I fall on opposite ends of that spectrum, where you are all unicorns, one light and meditation, and I'm like, give me that knife and give me all those drugs and pump me full of it. But the fact remains that regardless of how the birth goes, there is still complicated emotions around it, which can evolve into a trauma. My birth was a major source of trauma for me because it tied back into my sense of a lack of bodily autonomy. And bodily autonomy being taken away from me by medical professionals. And it was kind of an opposite of what you hear very often in India, C-section being pushed. For me, it felt like C-section was being taken away from the table for way too long, and I was put through a labor that was extremely long. And it felt like my body didn't belong to me anymore, right? It was a very fundamental thing of your body is now a mechanism, a vessel. You are absolutely not important here. What is important is the output, which is the child. But how we get to that, you are not important in it anymore. And this was bringing it back to the trauma conversation that keeps popping up. And we've had many, many women and parents coming through circles and so many different birth stories, but almost all of them resulted in some kind of trauma.
And not just that, it was also things that they hadn't spoken about after, because partly the exhaustion takes over, or, there is this new child in your life that requires care. And you think, well, the bleeding has stopped and, you're able to move around now, so all is okay. And so many women continued to grieve, perhaps their vision of how their birthing experience would be, perhaps that moment where they felt like they weren't heard, and what it did to them. The impact was, for me, very surprising, because like we were talking about, I had a very different birthing experience, and I had the doula and I advocated for myself a lot. But even then, I remember, through my vision boards and conversations and meditations, having to somehow push against, like I was trying to tell people who undoubtedly were my well-wishers and definitely more educated than me in this regard, to say, hey, this is my body, this is what I want. And I need you to sort of go along with it. So unless me or the baby are not in danger, then this is the plan. And why am I having to tell you this yet again? This idea of like, it is at the same time this powerful experience, and you're this whatever goddess who's now finally giving birth, but also you're an ailing patient in a hospital and nobody should listen to you because you're not in your right mind. So let somebody else make the decision for you. That's the contradiction that I found difficult to wrap my head around.
But even for you who had this extremely empowering birth and you kind of stepped into your physical and mental strength, even you carried a lot of guilt later on about talking about it, because you felt like you were betraying the sisterhood, because all of us were sitting there crying, oh my God, this was so terrible. And you're, oh, okay, then I'm not even going to talk about how amazing this can be, because I feel like I'm betraying this greater like pain and suffering that's almost communal, which is again inherently deeply disempowering, right? So what do
we allow women to talk about? Is this even conversations that you have at all post the baby?
So for me, one of the questions that I've been thinking about a lot is, what does feminist gynecological and birth care actually, and post-birth care actually looks like? And nota bene, I am very firmly and deeply on the side of science, doctors, hospitals, vaccinations, and everything else. So I do not identify with any of the more alternative and fringe ways of looking at birth. But I do believe that there is something fundamentally wrong about the way that we see birthing bodies and people carrying pregnancies to term. And if this is true for me, who comes from an extremely privileged position, then how horrendous it must be for women and birthing people of any kind of marginalization, right? I'm highly educated and I still wasn't listened to, right? So I can't imagine what it's like for a woman who doesn't even speak the language that the doctors speak in the hospital, right? What is it like for gender minorities? So what as inclusive feminist care looks like that is still keeping at the forefront scientific principles, safety, and so on, because there are a lot of kind of more alternative approaches to it. But is there any way that there is a marriage between these two that is sustainable?
And how it would have to go fundamentally against this idea of it at that point, it's communal property almost, isn't it? Just the way that we see children as communal property. I mean, when it comes to that, there's the collective really wins over when it comes to negotiating with women's autonomy. There is this idea of we know what's best and we'll step in and do what's necessary. And how that kind of work is dismantling the idea that somehow women's voices are unnegotiable, are optional. It's really sort of taking ownership of public-private spaces where women feel like they can advocate for themselves and ask And you trust that. I think it also goes back a lot to this idea of you trust the woman to know what she wants and you allow for it.
Yeah, I think that for me, there is still a lot of unresolved issues that I carry around the whole process of birthing. And to be honest, it's one of the main reasons why I'm one and done, one off, but definitely a very important one. But it almost feels like it has overstayed its welcome. You're like, well, it's been 3 years now, get over it. But it has affected so many other parts of how I mothered, especially in the beginning. And it has horrendously and deeply and in many almost irreversible ways after this many years affected my body image, my relationship with myself. And that ultimately, obviously, spills over into the relationship and intimacy that you have with your partner as well. So all of these things cannot be looked at as if they happen in a vacuum, right? They do really interact with all of our other parts of our lived experience as women, as human beings, and as mothers, because we do not stop being all of the other things just because we became mothers or parents.
Right. And even without the trauma, I feel like intimacy undergoes such immense change in a couple post the birth of a baby. And again, it's another area that's so difficult to talk about because you're already in the middle of so many transitions and, you're sort of kind of trying to put your body back together and you're exhausted. So the last thing on your mind is sex anyway. And the strain that the two of you are feeling, just trying to keep up with all these new roles and additions to your life, to then be like, hey, when is the last time we had date night? Or, it can be such a challenge.
Yeah, but I think that also for women, and I'm going to do a gross generalization here, but it is extremely difficult to switch into kind of an intimate mood if other parts of the relationship are feeling out of whack or out of balance, right? So if the labor and the mental load and the emotional load feel solely on your shoulders, then it's very, very difficult to go from, oh crap, I need to order more diapers and we're out of dish soap to, hi, I missed you. How have you been, right? And a lot of the conversation that we have been having around this past year is growing frustration on both sides because partners just feel like, who is this person? This is not the person that I have necessarily married, or at least I thought so. And this chasm becomes bigger and bigger, and you kind of end up being just ships in the night.
I remember one of the things that my husband said to me early on was he felt like an outsider. All of a sudden there was this dyad between me and the baby. Like we'd been the same body for so long and, we were slowly kind of finding our own. And often he felt like he was on the outside of it. And I could see how that would have felt to somebody who was like, hey, you were my person. Now, all of a sudden, there's this person who you clearly feel far more a sense of maybe love, attachment, sense of duty than you do me. So there's also all those things that are, again, difficult to talk about because navigating complex emotions is not always easy.
Especially in a country where we have to acknowledge that there are different ways of getting married, right? There are different ways of finding your spouse. It is not just the meet cute over a bar and now we love each other and we're going to get married. It is a social contract as well, right? So how does that social contract that then change due to a new person in your life? And what are the expectations? And I always kind of feel like when I see all these dynamics changing so drastically, I always kind of feel like, don't marry like useless people, right? Like don't marry useless men. But then I also think to myself, but are you also giving them the space? Right? Are you giving them the space to still feel valued and important and as a team member? And very often I'm also guilty of that, of not looking at us as a team.
And I'm still breastfeeding for the last year and a half, and I still don't feel like my body is mine. I feel like my child clearly feels a lot of ownership. And now that she has language, she's just like, mama do. And while I'm negotiating this sense of like, I can't wear the clothes I want, there is still so much care physically and physiologically I have to offer until I reclaim a sense of like ownership of my body. I think it's just sex is not going to feel the same. Desire is not going to feel the same.
Yeah, and really so much of looking at parenting through a feminist lens and even just talking today comes down to that feeling of bodily autonomy, right? It really does come down to the fact that you're almost leasing out your body. And this is such a fundamental tenet of feminism, right? Is that your body is yours, number one. But for such a long time in a woman's life, if she chooses to have children, especially if she chooses to have biological children, that is simply not the case, right? So it fundamentally shakes up the way that you look at yourself as an autonomous person moving through this world.
Right. And that you should want more, like you have this like happy heterosexual union and now a child. So now you should be content and, do not also be demanding sort of healthy sexuality over and above all that's already been given to you.
Okay, so it becomes almost like this extra layer of stuff that you're responsible for, right? Because having healthy sexuality attitudes and having healthy attitudes towards sex and sexuality and your physical body really translates into a lot more than just sex, right? It is living without shame, having a nice relationship with your body, making healthy and safe sexual decisions, keeping yourself safe, and all sorts of different things that really stem from this shame, right? That we oftentimes bring to the table. And if we don't deal with this ourselves, then there's very little chance that we're going to be teaching our children healthy behaviors.
Absolutely. And it isn't even just, it's also your body image. It isn't even just about what you derive pleasure from, but it's also what are the ways in which you are respecting another person's body and choice and consent and all the implications of that in our country, particularly for what the rape statistics